This is part 3 of the briefest of versions of photo history, or the history of photography. And part 3 is about photo manipulation. So we're going to look at a few things about how photos have been manipulated over the history of photography. We all think about Photoshop as a new thing and causing this sort of riff in photography that nothing is real anymore. But as we find out throughout the history of photography, this has been happening. So Henry Fox Talbot, we talked about him in part 1. He was one of the 3 to 4 guys that was working to create the most sort of practical photographic process in the beginning. And here is maybe the earliest example of photo manipulation. In the upper left is the negative, and this is called the 4 monks, but you can see that there's a 5th monk that's in there that gets eliminated from the photo. So they used a process basically called etching, where they sort of destroy the integrity of that part of the image. They just sort of scratch out that person. And you can see that the sky wants to kind of go white in the final print anyway. So all they had to do was really kind of eliminate the density of that person so that they eliminated that person. And so you can see in the final image that there's only the 4 monks that end up printing. And so photo manipulation has been around really since the dawn of photography. There is even a school of camp that says any photograph is basically a manipulation because you are deciding what's in that frame, what the viewer is seeing, and what parts of it are there. And you're presenting it as much as fact as you can in most cases. So in the 1850s, photographers started doing something called spirit photography. So this is Mary Todd Lincoln and the widow of President Lincoln. And then there is sort of a photo of Lincoln that's behind her. So it's superimposed over to look as if it's the ghost of Lincoln that's kind of coming to be with her. So you can see that is happening sort of early on as well, that manipulation of things. This is considered to be the first photo montage. And this is Henry Peach Robinson in 1858. And what he did here is he wanted to depict a scene of a young girl surrounded by her grieving family as she was dying. And it's all a product of his imagination. So he photographed this. It is, I think it's 5 or 6 different images that he has montaged together into one. Whether he cut them out and pasted them together or printed them separately, he's put them together in a way that they now create a new story. But it is I think it's 5 different negatives that he used to make this image appear the way that it appears. And so again, we can think of Photoshop as being the downfall to the validity of photography, but that validity has been in question since day one. This is Thomas Hicks, Matthew Brady. I don't think they actually collaborated, but it's called the Lincoln Calhoun Composite. And it's a photograph, it's a very famous photograph of Abraham Lincoln, but it's actually Lincoln's head on Calhoun, John Calhoun's body. And the Lincoln's head that he used in this composite is Matthew Brady's portrait of Lincoln. That's actually the portrait of Lincoln that's on the $5 bill now. And so he took this photo of Calhoun and he superimposed the head of Lincoln on it. And they did this after Lincoln's death. And the reason that they did it is they didn't have any heroic photos of Lincoln. And so they created one so that they would have this heroic photo of Abe Lincoln. And I guess one of the big controversies is that he flipped Lincoln's head to make it fit right on this body. And in doing so, the famous mole on Lincoln's face ends up not being on the right side of his face. The other kind of interesting side note on this is that, Lincoln freed the slaves, and John Calhoun was actually on on the opposite side of the idea and was in favor of the slaves. So this is an 1889 composite, artistic composite. So the ones we've seen so far are kind of very realistic looking. And then photographers started to kind of play around and see what they could get away with and how they could make it work. And so this is either a composite or perhaps a multiple exposure, but it's a picture of someone with a pump holding the pump up, and then a photo of someone's head that's been enlarged to look like it's being inflated. Pretty straightforward, fun little camera / darkroom trickery to make it all kind of work. This is one from 1930, another unknown artist. Really kind of fun because they are doing sort of illogical, impossible things. So they may have had these guys pose and then cut them out and then superimpose them over this image and maybe rephotograph it. But basically utilizing some trickery in photography to give us sort of a photorealistic illustration of something that can't happen. And then as we move through the Depression era, we get this, what is probably one of the most famous photographs out there, Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother from 1936. And you can see on the cardboard plate on the left, that is the image as it is registered in the Library of Congress. And the mother's thumb is holding the drapery back so that you can see into the tent. After it was submitted to the Library of Congress and they had their copies and their things, Dorothea Lange decided she didn't want the thumb to be there, and so she asked her assistant to retouch it out. And so you can see on the right that Florence Thompson's thumb has now been completely, well, almost 98% completely obscured. If you know to look for it, you can kind of see it there, but it's mostly filled in so that you can't really see it. And this kind of goes into this idea that we look at the Migrant Mother and we think of it as sort of a documentary piece, a final piece, non-retouched, non-manipulated piece. But as Dorothea Lange sort of moved along in her career, she decided to do things to her photos to make them maybe more commercially appealing. No one's quite sure of what the reasoning is for her doing that, but she definitely made some decisions to do that. Photo retouching and manipulation has been a part of sort of altering photos in history. So this is Benito Mussolini riding a horse, and he's holding a sword above his head. And you can see in the photo on the left, it's very sort of majestic and powerful with those clouds in the sky and him sitting on the horse. But then you see on the right that there weren't clouds in the sky, and there was actually somebody standing there holding the horse to have it hold still so that they could take the photo. So you can see that, again, the manipulation is ever present and been there. Some photographers use it to change the nature of what the photograph is, to maybe add some false sense of history, as we've seen. But some photographers, like Jerry Ulsman in the 70s and 80s, used it to kind of create that surreal environment. So this is conventionally done. This is all done in the darkroom. There are probably 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 images that are in here. And he would create masks in the darkroom that would mask out areas so that he could print. And he would have multiple enlargers set up, and he would move his print from one enlarger to the next and print each segment onto the paper and then process it out. At one point, Adobe approached him and wanted to talk to him about Photoshop, and he wanted nothing to do with Photoshop. He thought Photoshop was evil and not worth doing. And that, of course, is because he had this process down and he could create this art and kind of make things happen. So then that sort of leads us into this digital manipulation that's happening. And this is Gordon Gann's photo of the Great Pyramids. And on the right is his original photo. And on the left is what National Geographic did to the photo because they wanted it to fit the vertical format of the cover. And so they actually scooted the two pyramids closer together so that they filled in a better vertical image. They took a lot of flack for this because people realized what they had done and realized that it was an image that couldn't be taken. And it really sort of changed the nature of how National Geographic dealt with its photography. This is one of those things of like the digital revolution came and allowed them to do this, so they thought they could get away with it. But it turns out that people wanted more integrity from National Geographic. And so they had to kind of circle back and make that happen. So this was maybe done digitally, but probably not with Photoshop. Photoshop wasn't really around in 1982. Photoshop sort of appeared in 1988, 89. And so this would be Photoshop that would appear in 1988, 89. So this is the big step in photography, right? We've now gone from having to do it all conventionally and deal with it all to being able to bring it into a computer and move it around either pixel by pixel or even just sampling colors and utilizing those colors. But this was the first photoshopped image, and this is called Jennifer in Paradise, and it's actually photographed by Thomas Knoll, who is one of the founders and inventors of Photoshop, and it's his fiancée at the time, soon-to-be wife. And it is the first photoshopped image. What's been photoshopped on it, I'm not exactly positive, but it has been moved through Photoshop and manipulated in Photoshop and then sent back out from Photoshop. So if we fast forward a little bit more to about 2000, we have Maggie Taylor. And Maggie Taylor uses found imagery and shoots some imagery and creates photo composites and sort of urban landscapes and sort of surreal montages completely in Photoshop. So she brings all of her elements in and does everything in Photoshop. The opposite of Jerry Ulsman. The interesting fact is she's married to Jerry Ulsman. So he's Mr. Do It All in the Darkroom and she's Mrs. Do It All in Photoshop. So the two of them each had their art form that was sort of opposed to the others in some certain sense, but is very interesting to kind of see how that plays out. But she uses really photorealism to create these surreal looking images. You can see that she's making shadows and creating shadows and adding motion blur and doing all of the sort of conventional, traditional photo techniques, but doing them all digitally in Photoshop. So that is, again, an extremely brief run through photo history or the manipulation of photos through photo history. I hope you guys enjoyed it.